So let's start with segment one. In segment one, we'll be examining the elements of gender stratification. So we're going to get some concepts and terms that sociologists use and utilize to be able to understand and examine the stratification system as it relates to gender. So one of the first two concepts that sociologists have to be aware of is the concept of sex and the concept of gender. In our everyday life and our everyday language, we tend to use sex and gender as the same concept. So we'll talk about sex, individual sex differences, and individual gender differences as if they are in and of the same thing. Sociologists make the distinction between sex and gender and refer to sex as the biological characteristics that are different from person to person. Right? So sex is to refer to the biological characteristics regarding individuals, and we refer to sex as either being male, female, or intersexed. Right? So the three different categories of sex, when sociologists are referring to sex or the biological differences, we refer to people as either being male or being female, or in some cases intersexed, having to some extent or another the characteristics, the sexual characteristics of both male and female. So sex refers to the biological characteristics. Gender then refers to the social characteristics. The social characteristics regarding different categories of people, right? Regarding different categories of people. So when sociologists refer to gender characteristics, we don't refer to males and females and to intersexed individuals. We refer to men and women as well as genderqueer individuals. So men representing the social characteristics associated with the category of manhood, women to represent the social characteristics associated with womanhood, and then genderqueer to represent the social characteristics of either a combination of man or woman or the absence of those characteristics in an individual. So sociologists have to be very, very careful in parsing between biological and social. So we refer and use language that is very specified when talking about either the biological characteristics or social characteristics. So sociologists, when they're talking about males and females, we're typically referring to the primary and secondary sex characteristics of individuals. When we talk about men and women, we are referring to the social categories and the behavioral practices and cultures associated with manhood and womanhood. Aside from referring to men and women, when we're talking about gender, we may also refer to things, objects, behavioral patterns, values, other types of cultural norms as either being masculine or feminine or androgynous, referring to or relating to neither or a combination of both masculine and feminine behaviors, norms, values, practices, etc. So, aside from thinking about sex and gender, oftentimes, in our everyday lives, we don't only just conflate sex and gender, we also conflate sex, gender, as well as sexual orientation. So sexual orientation, sociologists also are careful to kind of parse out and keep separate, oftentimes discussing separately. Sexual orientation refers to the characteristics of both romantic as well as sexual attraction that one may have for another person. So when sociologists are referring to sexual orientation, we don't typically refer to males and females. We don't typically refer to men or women or masculine or feminine. We tend to refer to things like heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, a combination of, or or asexuality, the absence of a sexual orientation within an individual. So as you can already start to see, when it comes to examining gender stratification, sociologists have to be very, very careful in parsing these three different types of concepts. Sex referring to biological characteristics, gender referring to the social characteristics, and then sexual orientation referring to both the attraction, right, romantic attraction, as well as the sexual attraction that one may have for another person. Now, each culture, when it comes to gender, has its own set of characteristics for qualifying people into either being masculine or feminine, either being considered a man or considered a woman, being considered androgynous or being considered genderqueer. And the same is actually true for categories such as sex and sexual orientation. Sociological studies have demonstrated that when we look from across societies, when we look from society to society, the basic norms and practices, attitudes and values, the culture, in essence, differs according to whether or not a person is going to be characterized as masculine, whether the person is going to be characterized as feminine, as well as whether or not the person is going to be characterized as a male, as a female, as a heterosexual, as a homosexual, as asexual, as bisexual. So how do we get lumped into these different categories is oftentimes dependent on the definitions that are set forth from that particular culture, right, from that particular culture. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we continue to discuss the elements of gender stratification. But to kind of summarize this, think about it like this. We inherit our sex, right? It comes to us biologically. We get it from our genes and our hormones. And we learn our gender. We learn the cultural practices, the values, the attitudes, the norms that then confirm ourselves as either being masculine or feminine or androgynous or genderqueer, being in the category of manhood or being firmly located in the category of womanhood. Although these two things oftentimes relate to one another, sometimes they go together with one another or correlate, other times they do not. And so sociologists have to be very careful when we're talking about sex and gender and sexual orientation to be aware that sex, gender, and sexual orientation do not always kind of conform or correlate the same way across all individuals. This is a kind of a cute little diagram that might help to explain what sociologists mean regarding these distinctions that sociologists make when looking at gender stratification. Along with gender, sex, and sexual orientation, this particular diagram adds the notion of gender identity, right? Gender identity here. So identity, it relates to how you, in your mind, identify with a particular category of either being a woman or being manly, right? Manliness or womanliness. Our expression, or gender expression, is the way in which we conform our body, including our clothing, our hairstyle, our posture, our gesture, and our interactions as either being feminine or masculine in nature, right? Feminine or masculine in nature. So we can think about gender identity expression, or gender expression, as being, for instance, a person who is trying to express a masculine identity on the exterior may do things like grow a beard, may take ample time and effort to work out in such a way that they get big biceps and a big chest. Right? They may wear clothing that is expressive of the masculine gender, so wearing suits and ties, or maybe wearing some type of clothing that indicates manhood. And then in addition to that, they may do things, behave through gesture and interaction in ways that confirm their manhood, playing sports, maybe acting tough around people, etc. So there's different ways of expressing one's gender identity, and that may be consistent with or totally inconsistent with the person's sex, which may be male, female, or intersexed. And independent of their expression and independent of their biological sex, they may be romantically or physically attracted to people of a different sex, or maybe people of the same sex, or maybe people that are in some way, shape, or form a combination of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex as well. Y'all follow me so far? Raise your hand if you're following me. Yeah, this takes a little bit of, this takes a little bit to get used to, especially whenever you are acting as a sociologist or thinking like a sociologist, to keep these terminologies kind of completely separate in your mind, when our tendency in our culture is oftentimes to conflate them. It can be a difficult task. It can be a really difficult task. So, when we're referring to biological sex, sociologists typically distinguish between what is known as the primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics of humans. And this is absolutely consistent with how biologists explain, discuss, and debate biological characteristics referring to sex. So primary sex characteristics for males include things like the sexual organs, the penis, the scrotum, the testes, the prostate, and other components or organs or parts of organs that are related to the sexual reproductive system. And the same is true for females. The primary sex characteristics of females include the labia, the clitoris, the vagina, the uterus, and ovaries. And the other corresponding components that relate to the sexual reproductive systems of females. And then the primary sex characteristics of an intersex person may include a combination of, in many different ways, shapes, and forms, the differing primary sex characteristics of males and of females. So sometimes people are born with entirely working, functioning both sets of reproductive organs. But in many cases, most people are, when they're born intersexed, are born with some components or some parts of the reproductive system of males, some components or some parts of the reproductive system of females. So when we're talking about intersex people, we're looking at a combination thereof of the primary sex characteristics. Aside from primary sex characteristics, sociologists and biologists demarcate a wide variety of secondary sex characteristics. And if you want to think about the difference between primary and secondary sex characteristics, think about the things that are biological, that relate to males and females, but are not part of the reproductive system. Are not part of the reproductive system. So, for males, biologists have demonstrated that human males tend to have heavier bones, a heavier bone structure, as well as an increased muscle mass in comparison to females. Males tend to grow more explicitly and to a greater extent facial hair in comparison to females. And then males also have the secondary sex characteristic for many males of hair loss, also known as male pattern baldness. These secondary sex characteristics are not relating to the sexual reproductive system of males, but yet we see biological differences along the lines of body mass, in terms of muscle as well as bone mass, and then in terms of hair growth, where it occurs and to what extent it occurs, that relate directly to those sexual reproductive organs, right? Those sexual reproductive organs. For females, we see secondary sex characteristics include the growth and enlargement of the breast, the widening of the hips. Females tend to have a larger amount of muscle mass growth behind the femur. So it's the rear thigh muscle tends to be larger in comparison to males. And females tend to have an elongated upper arm, about 2 centimeters on average in comparison to males, in comparison to their height. So these particular characteristics are biological in nature, but do not relate to the sexual reproductive system of females, right? Are not part of the sexual reproductive system, but in fact relate to some of the processes, biological processes that occur as a result of females being born with their particular configuration of reproductive organs. Okay? So sex refers to both primary as well as secondary sex characteristics. Primary characteristics are the differences and variations of the reproductive organs, and then secondary sex characteristics are the biological changes that are not related to the sexual reproductive organs, but are a result of having a particular configuration of sexual reproductive organs. So, what do we mean by this? Well, how do secondary sex characteristics occur within individuals? And why do we see such a wide variety of differences in secondary sex characteristics in individuals? So, like the greatest way to put this, or I think the most clear way to put this, is that men tend to have, on average, a greater amount of hair growth, especially facial hair growth, in comparison to women. But we know that that ranges widely. That some men are able to grow very full, very thick beards in a short period of time, while other men are unable to grow very full, very thick beards, even over the course of a long period of time. And what sociologists find is that there's kind of a biological role in this, as well as a social role in the creation and accentuation of secondary sex characteristics. So what is biology's role in all of this? Well, first, biology's role is the gifting of the different sex chromosomes. So if you are born with an XY configuration of chromosomes, you will, in your 23rd pairing, you will be born a male. All right, you will be born a male. If you are gifted with the configuration of sex chromosomes to be XX in your 23rd pairing, you will be born a female. In addition to these typical configurations of pairings of chromosomes, we also see the multiplication of chromosomes on the 26 pairing. So some people are born with 3 pairs of X chromosomes. Some people are born with 4 pairs of X chromosomes. Some people are born with 5 or 6 or even 8 pairs of sex chromosomes. This is known as tetrachromosomality. And although it is rare, we know that, for instance, women, there's about a 1 in 1,000 chance that a woman is born with 3 X chromosomes. This has been termed, quote unquote, the super female. And if you want to know the difference in terms of behavioral patterns or in terms of biological difference for a female to be born with 3 X chromosomes, there are in fact no known differences. So biologists and sociologists have been unable to see how any differences whatsoever in a woman being born with 3 X chromosomes in comparison to being born with 2 X chromosomes. But yet the term super female has come up in the literature from time to time. Sometimes males are born with 2 Y chromosomes, right? 2 Y chromosomes. And there was some discussion and debate in the literature about males being born with an extra Y chromosome. It was thought that males would have an increase in testosterone production, would have a decrease in intelligence, would have an increase in behavioral differences. But in fact, the early data that kind of pointed to differences in males that are born with an extra Y chromosome as having impulsivity problems, problems with testosterone production, and so forth, have largely been in science discredited. So just as females are born with, about 1 in 1,000 females are born with 3 X chromosomes, there's a certain portion of the population of males that are born with 2 Y chromosomes. And we see that there is very little to no difference between the behavioral patterns of males born with the XY pairing versus the XYY pairing. And then finally, some males are born with 2 X chromosomes. So an XXY pattern. And this is actually known as Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome. And there are a lot of different behavioral changes, as well as changes to this particular person who is paired XXY, which is known as Klinefelter syndrome. And if you're interested, you can look up Klinefelter syndrome as well as all of the associated changes biologically to the individual who is born with both pairings XXY. In addition to chromosomes, role in shaping our primary sex characteristics, as a result of our primary sex characteristics or our sexual organs, we have changes and differences in our hormones. So hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone differ according to whether or not a person is born with male primary sex characteristics or born with female primary sex characteristics. So just by virtue of being born with testes or being born with ovaries means that there's going to be slight differences in the overall production of testosterone, the overall production of estrogen, and the overall production of progesterone in the individual throughout their life course. And in a lot of ways, this shapes secondary sex characteristics. Right? It shapes secondary sex characteristics. We know that testosterone production is both related to the growth of facial hair, as well as the loss of, progesterone is related to the loss of hair on the top of the head, or male pattern baldness. And so the particular configurations of the sex organs relate to overall configurations of hormones within the individual. So it almost looks like, at this point, that biology has this huge role in shaping who we become in terms of our gender identity, as well as our gender expression. Biology creates for us a configuration of sex organs, which then relate to the production of hormones, which then shape secondary sex characteristics to a certain extent. But what sociologists find is that society's role plays just as important role in comparison to biology, especially when we're talking about the shaping of the secondary sex characteristics. So for instance, children are encouraged to, sometimes forced to, sometimes select into different types of play that relate to gender identity as well as gender expression. So to put this in more simpler terms, play for little boys and play for little girls look a lot different. So what are some of the types of play that little boys, ages, if we're going to go back to socialization, in the play stage, age 2 to age 7 looks like? Anybody ever hang out with like a 2-year-old to 7-year-old boy? What does play for a 2-year-old to a 7-year-old boy typically look like? What are some of the things that they do?
Like action figures as opposed to Barbie dolls.
So they play with action figures as opposed to Barbie dolls. So the types of dolls that they play with are a little bit different. What else? What other differences do we see? Go ahead.
Trucks and tractors.
So they play with trucks and they play with tractors. What type of play do they do when they're playing with their dolls and their trucks? Go ahead. So they tend to be more active, sometimes we could say accidentally more violent, right? They get into fights or scuffles. They tend to be more active. What about for little girls? What do little girls play whenever they're age 2 to age 7? Put yourself back in your young child's shoes and think about the things that you played with and things that you did as a young child. What were some things that you did? Go ahead.
I didn't
So play house. What else do 2-year-old to 7-year-old girls play? Go ahead, in the back.
We used to play dress up.
So we play dress up, right? What else do you guys do? What other types of play do 2 to 7-year-old girls do in general? Go ahead.
I don't know if this is considered like playing, but sometimes you'll just like talk. Like boys don't really talk when they're playing.
Yeah, so they spend a lot of time talking, playing house, tea parties, dress up. Boys spend a lot of time outdoors. So sociologists have kind of documented the types of play that boys and girls do. Boys tend to be more active at an earlier age, even before the play stage, all the way up to about 6 months, or all the way down to about 6 months. Parents allow boys to be much more active, taking them out of their cradle, taking them out of their, their restraints and letting them walk around and play around, more so than girls. Parents are more likely to allow boys to play outdoors, encourage boys to play outdoor behaviors and games. Young girls are encouraged more to play inside and to be less active in their types of play. So drawing, tea parties, house, chats, and things like that are far more encouraged amongst girls in comparison to boys. So the socialization that we receive from our early ages on actually kind of create a feedback loop with our biology. So boys, as they are more active, actually increases, and they remain active, not just as little boys, but as young adolescents and even into early adulthood. They tend to remain far more active in comparison to girls, which relates to a feedback loop in the testosterone production, which relates to the secondary sex characteristics of males. And females, their inactivity and the types of play and behavior that they do actually relates to estrogen and progesterone production, which creates almost like a feedback loop back into the individual that relates to the creation and emphasis of their secondary sex characteristics. So you can already start to see that biology and environment, right, our social environments, play an integral role at the development of our biological beings. And then this doesn't kind of stop at childhood, right? It doesn't stop at adolescence. It continues into adulthood and throughout our entire lives. So when we talk about social structure, we remember that structure includes these different institutions. Our government, our education institution, our family institution, our economic institution, and then finally our religious institution. And if you think about these different institutions, they are both gendered, meaning there are specific positions and social statuses within these institutions that are exclusively for men and exclusively for women. And then there are a wide variety of positions and social statuses that are reserved, maybe not exclusively for men or for women, but are reserved for the majority of men or for the majority of women to undergo. So they're both gendered institutions and they're gendering institutions. When we get into these different social statuses and social positions, the expectations of how we behave are typically supposed to be consistent with behavioral patterns that relate to either being a man or being a woman. So our society or our social world relates almost, I would say as a sociologist, as much as, if not more than, the biological role in shaping the biological sex of males and females.